Okay, after the first session, which was a very nice session, we are coming to the second session, that is a pediatric cardiac anesthesia. And the moderator for pediatric cardiac anesthesia session is Dr. Saibal Chaudhary, Roy Chaudhary from Kolkata. Over to Saibal.
Thanks, Dr. Sneep. Welcome you all in session 2, the session of pediatric cardiac anesthesia. It's my great pleasure to introduce all esteemed chairpersons for this session. Dr. C. Kumar of Madras Medical Mission, Chennai, Dr. A. M. Jagdish from Sri Jayadeva Institute, Bangalore, Dr. Muralidhar Kachi from Narayan Hridaya, Bangalore, and Dr. Suresh Chengore from Sultan Qaboos University Hospital, Muscat. I request the first chairperson, Dr. C. Kumar, to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Sridhar Joshi.
Good afternoon to everybody. The first talk in session 2 would be on peri-op decision making in congenital heart surgery, the role of the cardiac anesthesiologist and TE. This will be delivered by Dr. Sridhar S. Joshi, who's from the Nara Institute of Cardiac Sciences, Bangalore, and a special interest in RV in congenital cardiac surgery. I would ask Professor A. M. Jagdish to introduce the second speaker.
Yeah. Let me welcome Mr. Kamlesh Taylor, who is a chief pediatric cardiac anesthesiologist at Kokilaben Ambani Hospital at Mumbai. He's going to deliberate on the most important topic of low cardiac output after pediatric cardiac surgery. I welcome Dr. Kamlesh Taylor. I request next speaker to be introduced by Dr. Kanchi Muralidhar.
It's an absolute pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Ritesh Shah, who is the professor of cardiac anesthesia in Union Mehta Institute of Cardiology. He's well experienced and he has a number of contribution in terms of publications and guest lectures. And I welcome him to join us to deliver a talk on anesthetic management of TGA. Thank you so much. I hand over the mic to Dr. Saibal Chaudhary.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. We request all the three speakers to present their topic one after another. The question and the answer will be taken after the presentations of all three topics. Please write your comments and questions in the comment box on the right side of your session. And please do mind, we cannot take all the questions and we cannot deliver all the answers because of the time limit. The session time is till 5 o'clock. Now, can we have these three presentations one after another?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, thank IACTA for giving us a chance to present in this virtual IACTA 2021. Today, we're going to talk on perioperative decision-making in congenital heart surgery, the role of transesophageal echo and the cardiac anesthetist behind it. We all agree on the fact that TE has an integral role in the model congenital heart surgery era, the reason being the language, because the TE talks the language of anatomical description of lesions, and that makes the basis of decision-making in the perioperative period. A lot of guidelines have come up regarding the conduct of transesophageal echo, but what matters most is in a given scenario, what decision has to be made, and guidelines continue to be elusive on that fact. Surgeon's language is particularly based on structure that he handles, and hence he has a tendency to focus on a few facts more than the other, which is a norm in congenital heart surgery era, and transesophageal echo helps out in defining those structural differences. Going on to the monetary value this adds, it's pretty obvious way back since 2005 itself that transesophageal echo continues to be a cost-effective strategy to reduce costs related to reoperations due to residual lesions or additional lesions. This was monetarily defined also as well in the form of reduced cost in 2005 with US dollars of close to 2,500, which converts to Indian dollar currency of around 1.5 lakhs. So it does carry a monetary value also for the stakeholders involved in the perioperative period. To divide the topic, I have divided it into the decision making of a true ventricle or a palliative repair that we can give to the kid, to guide the procedure to the perioperative team, and the adequacy of the repair in the postoperative period. In congenital heart surgery, it's pretty obvious to use the words bi and univentricular repairs. The whole of the team strives to give two ventricles to the child with which is close to being normal. This is not a question in simple congenital heart disease, but when it goes to complex congenital heart disease, the decision to give a biventricular or the force to, or the lesion forcing the giving only a univentricular repair have to be taken in the perioperative period. What matters the most, apart from other simple things, is ventricular size. If the adequate two ventricles, which follow the rule of thumb of the atrioventricular valve, the mitral and the tricuspid valve, it grossly can be defined that they can be given a biventricular repair, though there do exist variations or exceptions to this rule. And the second thing is, can we give a concordance at the atrioventricular level and at the ventriculoarterial level? Normal concordance means the right atrium opens in right ventricle, that opens in the pulmonary artery, goes lung, blood goes to the lung. Whereas the left atrium takes the oxygenated blood, opens to the left ventricle, and the aorta providing oxygenated blood to the ventricle. Can we give this complete repair? So the decision making is based on whether the ventricles are adequate and whether the great arteries are adequate for the given size or not. These decisions in the past were made by nomograms from Western data, where normal defined structural dimensions were mentioned for a given body surface area. Back to Indian data, in late 2018, we got a paper from Mumbai mentioning or studying the basic normal derived structures for pediatric populations, wherein they studied 1,000 odd normal kids with normal hearts and defined their normal mitral valve annulus, the tricuspid valve annulus, and across the spectrum of body surface areas. So these are more local information and might help us define the adequacy of ventricles in a given congenital heart lesion, so that we decide whether we give a biventricular or a univentricular repair. The same exists for the great arteries as well. The size of the aortic annulus, the size of the pulmonary annulus. Data are defined for pulmonary arteries, left and right pulmonary arteries as well. So taking these into considerations, putting your kid's value of body surface area and annulus in a given proforma helps us define whether they fall into normalcy, whether they fall into -1 zone of the z-score or the -2 of the z-score, helps defining the adequacy of the biventricular repairs. So in the perioperative period, surgeon and the team looks up for echo in the following basic headlines. Those includes whether the transthoracic echo definition was, diagnosis was right, are there any surprises in the in the early operative period. So we all know that the clamp is the most essential time, the cross clamp, and any surprise here will increase the time, and any plans to reduce this surprises will reduce the cross clamp time. A few unique or routine information that TE can help us is as simple as the presence of a patent ductus arteriosus. If there's a PDA, once we go on bypass, there are low perfusion pressures, we have a distending left ventricle. The issues related to difficulty in identification of a PDA do exist. So considering these facts, a simple aortic short axis view in which the continuous flow on the pulmonary artery will help us define whether there is a PDA. A short PDA ligation time will reduce the concerns on the cardiopulmonary bypass. Small misses of a subaortic membrane, small misses of a small right ventricular outflow tract obstruction in the transthoracic echo will help the surgeon plan better and reduce the cross clamp time. A simple presence of a patent foramen will change the whole cannulation strategies. For example, in a pulmonary valve implantation, a right-sided chamber surgery, a PFO presence will make the cross clamp mandatory, whereas a clear-cut absence of pulmonary absence of a PFO will make cannulation strategies different. So cannulation strategies do change in redo surgeries as well, based on the PFO presence or absence. Left superior vena cava is a common presence in congenital heart lesions. In the absence of a bridging vein, cannulation strategies for a need of LSVC cannulation is an obvious addition to the information to the surgeons. In a simple example that I gave, a presence of significant patent ductus arteriosus, a presence of aortic regurgitation in the preoperative period, presence of a SAM in this given individual. Once the PDA was closed, the aortic regurgitation increased because the diastolic pressure went up. So in this case, we had to go back on, we had to make a decision to going on bypass and resecting the subaortic membrane here. This is a post-repair one, when you see a SAM is nicely resected and the right coronary cusp is nicely mobile without any aortic regurgitation in this situation. So how else does the transesophageal echo help? We have a common question coming up in the perioperative period. Surgeon asking me, do you think this VSD can be approached to the right atrium? Do you think I have to do a right ventriculotomy? Or do you think all I can do is open up the P and close the VSD? So in this given situation, the access of the VSD makes a huge decision making in the perioperative strategies. This is an aortic short axis view in which we see a nice good pulmonary valve, and this is an outlet ventricular septal defect very close to the pulmonary annulus. If there are no additional lesions, this VSD can be easily tackled through the PA approach. So was done in this case. Going to an important valid question of rootability of ventricular septal defect, the VSD in the ventricular septal defect is of 4 gross types. The first 3 are the one which are close to the outlet. The subaortic went right under the aortic annulus, the subpulmonic right under the pulmonary annulus, and the doubly committed where the VSD has a common border from the aortic and the pulmonary annulus. The fourth one is the non-committed or a remote ventricular septal defect, which has the highest likelihood of failure for biventricular repair with a few exceptions. So the first 3 of them we can afford to give a try of biventricular repair in this situation. So this is one of the ways in which the VSD can present in a double outlet right ventricle to us, where the PA and the aorta both are opening to the right ventricle. In this situation, we see a remote ventricular septal defect that is in the inlet part of the ventricular septum. So if we look at for this in the LV long axis view, what do we do in our institute for rootability? Is we look at the ventricular septal defect, we look at the aorta, and we look at the LV. All of the 3 lying in the same plane of the multiplane in a LV long axis view guide towards a possibility of a rootability in a DORV. Another thing we look at is if we have an imaginary tunnel going through the interventricular septum, routing the left ventricle to the aorta, is there any structure coming in here? The absence of any atrioventricular leaflet tissue, either a straddling or a complete leaflet tissue present in the tract, goes against a clear product generation of an intraventricular tunnel. So these are the factors which we usually took in consideration in the perioperative period at our institute. What are the another important factors that decide rootability in a DORV are the distance between the tricuspid and the pulmonary annulus. Smaller the distance, you see there is a likelihood of an obstruction to the baffle that we can create. Looks more obvious in this picture. The smaller the distance between the tricuspid and pulmonary valve, smaller is going to be the baffle. So the post-operative left ventricular outflow tract obstruction or baffle obstruction are high risk in non-committed VSDs, where there is an aortic conus present, where the aorta is very anterior and this distance is small. This is a brief of simplified version of managing a double outlet ventricle as we do in our center. When an outlet VSD is present, if there is a pulmonary stenosis, it goes like a tetralogy of Faro variety and it goes through a repair at 4 to 6 months. If there is no pulmonary stenosis, then it goes in a VSD type of DORV with an intracardiac baffle. Subpulmonic VSDs go more to a Taussig Bing variety, undergo arterial switch, and non-committed usually end up being in single ventricle palliation. Now, after repairs, what we look at in congenital heart surgeries is a few residual lesions. Presence or absence of a PFO helps us direct, the direction of the stent helps us whether right ventricle is dysfunctional or is it adequate enough to take care of the post-operative phase. Whether the new tricuspid or aortic regurgitation, especially in perimembranous VSD, and of course the dysfunctional myocardium. Going to the residual lesions or additional lesions that we talk of, this is a case of an intracardiac repair for tetralogy of Fallot, where there was a muscular posterior VSD, posterior muscular VSD, where we located it to be behind the posterior tricuspid leaflet. The surgeon went back and closed it with a clean absence of any of those residual VSDs in the postoperative period. When do we address the additional or residual VSD? $1 million question, very few information in the literature available. Whereas the 2 of the important papers that I spoke are tell any VSD less than 2 mm more often than not closes in the postoperative period, and intramural VSDs are easily detectable by transesophageal echo with a very high specificity. What do we do in our institute? Multiple small VSDs below the moderator band, anything less than 3 millimeters, or small jets or residual VSDs in the danger area where the AV nodal tissue comes in, we let go, and most others we go back and return and repair them. The most important lesion tetralogy of Fallot, adequacy of right ventricular outflow tract obstruction. Way back since 1980, the PRALV ratio of 0.8 has proven, with lots of pros and cons, has still proven to be most commonly used perioperative strategy in deciding whether RVOTO is adequate or not. The newer concept in the last decade is looking for the pulmonary valve annulus Z-scores. If the pulmonary valve annulus Z-score is adequate or falling anywhere between -1 Z-score, we look for valve sparing surgeries. And again, I repeat, the Indian data might help in deciding these factors. Going with a pinch of salt, this pulmonary valve Z-score has not been convincingly associated with reduced reinterventions, but one dictum very clearly states is to address all the levels of obstruction in the right ventricular outflow tract, valve sparing should be looked at more in the tricuspid pulmonary valves than in the bicuspid or unicuspid valves. Going on to the left ventricular outflow or the right ventricular outflow tract obstructions in IVTR, these are valuable assets. We try to give a biventricular repair, but we'll end up probably with additional issues to the kit. So in this case, what we usually do is a deep transgastric view with some modified multiplane angle where we can see the outflow tracts. We can see a nice good ventricular septal defect closing the VSD, routing the LV to the aorta and the RV to the pulmonary arteries. If we look at this, we can see a lot of turbulence in both the outflow tracts. It is pretty much scary to look at these and tell that, you know, there's obstruction to left ventricular outflow tract and or otherwise. But we should always remember that these baffles are three-dimensional structures, and baffle literally means a tunnel with various shapes. So any turbulence at one place might not indicate an obstruction. Ideal way is to go and look at the gradients across them. And when we look at that, the left ventricular outflow tract peak gradient was 4 and the right ventricle peak gradient was 8. So what we usually take in our perioperative period is an left ventricular outflow tract gradient less than 25 and the right side less than 30 as an acceptable gradient across for these scenarios. Having said and done, these are all perioperative decisions as a team and not an individual. This discussion might be falling short of a detailed approach to almost all of them, but I've tried to cover most of the common concerns in the post-operative that can be picked up by transesophageal echo and guided appropriately. So we are more than open for discussions. Thank you.
Let me congratulate our IACTA team. Within a short period of time, they have arranged wonderful events. My name is Dr. Kamlesh, and I have given a topic which is very interesting to all of us, those who are doing a pediatric cardiac practice, that is low cardiac output after congenital heart surgery. If we are untreating this tiring ventricle soon become having a cardiac arrest, and that is why it is very important topic for all of us. Low cardiac output is, by definition, it is cardiac index less than 2 liter per minute per meter square. It is a transient and often reversible reduction in cardiac output with an associated decrease in systemic oxygen delivery. That means oxygen delivery is hampering, and that is why it is very important. If a low cardiac output is not been treated in time, it will progressively lead to multi-organ dysfunction, increased morbidity, prolonged ICU and hospital stay, and even mortality. And that is why we have to be very careful with dealing with such scenario. Before going to the main topic, I put you across to the few of the facts. Like blood pressure is not always saying about cardiac output. So high blood pressure does not rule out low cardiac output. Same with cold periphery also is not always associated with low cardiac output. That means even if the core temperature is low, there will be cold periphery and there will not be any low cardiac output. Increasing inotropy is not only modalities for treatment of low cardiac output. Sometimes it may worsen the scenario. Normal LV function is not always rule out low cardiac output. That means severe RV dysfunction also can cause low cardiac output. And in low cardiac output, right atrial pressure and left atrial pressure will not be normal or not be equal. And that is why using a preload will be difficult, or judging the preload will be difficult in such scenario. Coming to the incidence about low cardiac output, this has been described in 1975, and most of the literature it suggests around 25% of the children after cardiac surgery develop low cardiac output. It increases, the incidence increases in a group of where we are operating on neonatal cardiac surgery, or sometimes we are doing complex cardiac surgery, the incidence is increased. I will describe this very famous paper written by Jill Wernosky on post-operative course and hemodynamic profile after ASO in neonatal infant. What they have done is they have studied 171 patients of such group, and what their finding is they found low cardiac output in 24% of neonates. And what is surprising it, they in most of the patients subgroup they found low cardiac output after 9 to 12 hours after surgery. That means those who are new to this field, we are telling that first to 6 to 8 hours post-operative, it will be honeymoon period for most of the cardiac surgery. the problem start after 8 to 12 hours. So that is why one has to be very vigilant during this time. This gentleman, Mr. Victor, has described cellular and molecular mechanism of low cardiac output in pediatric cardiac surgery. And what he has mentioned about is immature myocardium, especially which we have seen in neonate and infants. What is immature myocardium? It is structurally quite different cell. It is rounded and short in compared to adult. The myofibrils are less dense and located peripherally. As the cell mature, they are increased in mitochondrial numbers, relative volume, crystal density, as well as sarcomere numbers. The laminin, which is extracellular matrix, is partially found in such kind of a myocardium, and that is why it has decreased myocardial reserve. Compliance and contractility also will be very low in neonatal period. That is why they are less capable of generating tension per unit per cross-sectional area, and that is why they are unable to handle large preload at a time, and they fail. Abnormal compliance and diastolic dysfunction is predominantly seen in single ventricle physiology. Calcium is very important because this myocardium is extremely sensitive to extracellular calcium because they have a poorly developed cytoplasmic reticulum. That is why it is very important role of calcium perioperatively. Ventricular hypertrophy and chronic cyanosis also having a very huge impact on developing post-operative low cardiac output in such kind of a patients. There are various reasons to develop low cardiac output. Let's see one by one. One is heart rate. If there is a lot of tachyarrhythmias, not a normal sinus rhythm, this patient will tend to develop low cardiac output. If there is a low in preload, sometimes it is low volume which is been given, or a lot of volume is been losing either from the blood or somewhere we are losing volume, or there is a cardiac tamponade. This patient may develop low cardiac output. Or if there is a ventricular contractility problem because of either myocardial protection problem intraoperatively, prolonged aortic cross-clamp time, ventriculotomy, residual shunt or gradient perioperatively, or a complex surgery. So the patient will have a low contractility and can cause low cardiac output. Increasing afterload, especially RV or as LV afterload increase, this ventricle will fail and can cause low cardiac output. Last, not the least, because of pump-related effects, SIRS can cause low cardiac output, and later on, even sepsis also can cause low cardiac output. So these are the few of the example of having a factor which can cause low cardiac output. There are a lot of signs and symptoms which we can predict low cardiac output early. One of the constant finding is higher heart rate, tachyarrhythmias, which is associated with low cardiac output. Borderline blood pressure for the age, and if it is along with high filling pressures like high RA pressures or LA pressures, this is one of the routine finding associated with low cardiac output. Low cardiac output definitely affect the renal function, and that is why the cardiac urine output will be usually low in such kind of cases. Peripheral temperature, low peripheral temperature in association with high core temperature. That means temperature gradient between core to periphery is significant. This is one of the early signs to diagnose low cardiac output clinically, and if it is in association with prolonged CRT. Metabolic acidosis on ABG with high lactate, and especially the trend of this high lactate and acidosis will tell us that patient is worsening on the ventricular functions or oxygen tissue delivery. Venous blood gas is very important. If it is significantly low saturation on venous blood gas, or there is a increased difference between arteriovenous gas, then we can say that this patient is in low cardiac output. Ventricular dysfunction also can be easily diagnosed by echocardiography. There are other tools which help in diagnosing low cardiac output, like continuous SCVO2 monitoring or NIRS. Some people are putting NIRS in abdominal wall or splanchnic perfusion or renal, and then predict low cardiac output very early. Some of the non-invasive cardiac output monitoring is also available for pediatric cardiac patients. There are various modalities of treatment for managing low cardiac output, like optimizing preload, contractility after load, optimizing ventilation, rhythm corrections, SIRS treatment, mechanical supports, and enable right to left shunt. Let's see one by one. So optimizing preload. All of us know Frank-Starling law. It means the greater the stretch, the greater the force of next contraction. So here the word is optimizing is very important, especially when the ventricle reside on the pressure stroke volume curve. It is essential to know what is optimal ventricular filling pressure, and it is difficult, especially in a setting of cardiopulmonary disease when there is no correlation between RA and LA pressures, and making it more challenging to determine what is the optimal filling pressures. Especially it will a clinician will judge it by stroke volume variations, pulse pressure variations, or it can be judged by low urine output or tachycardia. These are the few findings associated with low preload. If somebody is giving volume and there is a prompt decrease in heart rate or increase in venous saturation or blood pressure, it indicates that preload reserve is present, and that ventricle is operating on ascending portion of pressure stroke volume curve. If after volume there is lack of response, suggests that the ventricle are residing on a flat portion of their function curve, and additional volume will be detrimental for such kind of patients. One should use other modalities to treat low cardiac output. If someone is giving additional volume, that will increase the ventricular filling pressure, which will lead to increased myocardial oxygen demand and the formation of pulmonary edema. The assessment of preload of a particular is important, especially when there is ventricular compliance is impaired. And if you are using positive pressure ventilation, this will definitely confound the interpretation of arterial pressures and judging about the volume. Coming to the manipulating of systolic functions, after optimizing preload, one has to think about what will be the systolic function. If it is low, one can use catecholamines. The problem of using catecholamines are it increase the myocardial oxygen demand, and most of them are causes higher heart rate or tachyarrhythmias. Calcium is also plays important role perioperatively. One can use calcium to improve the myocardial oxygen contractility. Also, it will increase the smooth muscle tone. Manipulating LV after load, that means if a ventricular function is not normal or less than normal, one can use after load reduction, which will improve the stroke volume and cardiac output. It is most of the time it is done by use of phosphodiesterase 3 inhibitor. What it can do is it improve the inotrope. It can cause moderate inotropic support, reducing pulmonary vascular resistance and systemic vascular resistance. In addition, it causes less chronotropic, less arrhythmogenic, and have a less impact on myocardial oxygen demand. By preventing breakdown of cyclic AMP, it causes vasodilatation and vascular smooth muscle and leads to improved contractility. It do not rely on adrenergic receptor, and therefore it is immune to adrenergic receptor downregulations. Many of the studies have proven that use of milrinone will reduce the low cardiac output postoperatively. One can use nitroprusside and nitroglyceride also to help in reducing LV after load, but before using such kind of agent, one has to optimally preload the patients, otherwise it will be detrimental. Coming to the reducing RV afterload, if severe RV dysfunction is there, it can cause reduction in pulmonary blood flow, can cause hypoxemia, as well as reduction in LV preload can cause reduced cardiac output. And because of IVS shifting, because of severe RV dysfunction, the LV preload will be reduced and can cause severe low cardiac output. So that is why one has to be careful when there is a RV dysfunction which is severe. How to manage RV dysfunction and reduce RV afterload and reduce PVR? One of the easiest methods is to increase the FiO2, maintain the PO2 around 100 to 120, because oxygen is potent pulmonary vasodilator. Second way of reducing PVR and RV afterload is reduce PaCO2, because no, I'm not saying that PaCO2 come down to less than 30, but maintaining around 35 to 40 will be optimal to maintain the low RV afterload. And the third method is recruitment of lungs by optimizing PEEP. If you are achieving by FRC, both RV as well as LV afterload will be reduced by maintaining the proper PEEP. One can use pulmonary vascular reduction, PVR reduction agents, selective agents, if all other methods are not working. Coming to vasopressor therapy, vasomotor paresis is one of the problem in postoperatively because of a low vascular tone. Vasopressors act on V1 receptor causing vasoconstriction, and by using it augment SVR, improving mean arterial pressure, reduction in stroke volume and cardiac output, but it causes reduction in stroke volume and cardiac output. There are studies which suggest that use of vasopressor will be helpful, especially in early sepsis. This is really helpful. Coming to preserving or creating right to left shunt, especially when we are operating on early repair of tetralogy or truncus arteriosus, creating right to left shunt help in early RV dysfunction post-operatively because it acts as a pop-up valve. Coming to the Fontan palliation, if a high PVR is there, one can have a fenestration which will help in act as a pop-up valve and prevent low cardiac output post-operatively. Coming to the rhythm correction, it is important, especially in ventricular dysfunction and hypertrophied ventricle. The arterial cake is very important because it contributes almost 35 to 40% of cardiac output. Aggressive treatment of jet rhythm is important. Maintenance dose of magnesium help in preventing the tachyarrhythmias. If there is a bradyarrhythmias, one can start pacing, and if there is a tachyarrhythmia, synchronous cardiac version always help in improve the cardiac output. Using the steroid is old method. Especially it is useful when there is a catecholamine resistant shock, but it is act like a double-edged sword. There is a high dose of glucocorticoid associated with morbidity. It increases infection and sometimes increases the morbidity also. Mechanical circulatory support, if all pharmacological therapy has been failed, one can use this ECMO support, especially early rather than using it late. If somebody is using early, the results are really good, and the results are almost 50 to 60% of survival. Timing of ECLS, that is key determinant of outcome. And once somebody is putting on an ECMO, they should need to find out what is the residual mechanical problem and try to correct this. Specific measure to prevent low cardiac output, like keeping the sternum open, post-operatively help in preventing low cardiac output, leaving a vertical vein open, especially in obstructed TAPVC, fenestrated VSD closure when there is a borderline top or single lung repair in tetralogy will be helpful. Early extubation following Glenn surgery or Fontan surgery is good. Aggressive use of systemic vasodilator, especially in delayed arterial switch. Integrated ECMO circuit also for the delayed arterial switch will be helpful, preventing low cardiac output. Early pickup and aggressive treatment of sepsis definitely help in low cardiac output. And preoperative stabilization plays very important role in managing or preventing low cardiac output. Summarizing the treatment of low cardiac output, what I have mentioned, these are the options which we have already discussed. And I can say thank you. Prevention always better. And thank you very much for giving me opportunity. Thanks.
Good evening, chairpersons, moderator, all the faculties and delegates. I am thankful to the organizing committee for giving me such opportunity. Thanks once again. Transposition of the great arteries is the most common cyanotic congenital heart lesion that presented in neonatal age. It is defined as ventricular-arterial discordance along with the atrioventricular concordance. Aorta arises from the morphological right ventricle and pulmonary artery arises from the morphological left ventricle. It accounts for about 1/20th of all the congenital heart diseases, but contributes more than 1/5 of all mortalities in the infant age. Mortality is approximately 30% in first week, 50% in first month, and 90% by the end of first year if left untreated. With improved diagnostic, medical and surgical techniques, overall short-term and mid-term survival rate exceeds 90%. Inheritance is multifactorial, more common in infants of diabetic mothers. Maternal intake of alcohol, poor nutrition, and stressful life event during pregnancy increases the risk of transposition in offspring. As you can see in transposition, aorta is right and anterior in most of the cases. Both the great arteries run in parallel and do not cross over. There is a subaortic conus that separates aorta from the tricuspid valve, while the pulmonary valve is in fibrous continuity with the mitral valve. There are two parallel circuits in TGA, unlike series in normal circulation. So what happens? Oxygenated blood from pulmonary veins recirculates to LA-LV into pulmonary arteries, and deoxygenated systemic venous blood recirculates through right atrium, right ventricle into the aorta. Therefore, survival is only possible if there is a mixing between the two circulations, either at the level of atria, ventricle, or great arteries. The net volume of blood passing from one circuit to other should remain same over a short period of time. Otherwise, what happens? One circuit gets exhausted and other becomes volume overloaded. The intermixing depends on the location and size of the defect and magnitude of pulmonary blood flow. The size of the intermixing and pulmonary blood flow determines the fate of the patient. Pathophysiology, clinical presentation, and management of these patients depends on the presence or absence of associated lesions like TGA with interventricular septum, TGA with VSD, TGA VSD with pulmonary stenosis. Patient with interventricular septum usually present with deep cyanosis, tissue hypoxia, and acidosis that can be improved with prostaglandin infusion and or balloon atrial septostomy. Patient with moderate size VSD usually present with very mild cyanosis, but they have features of signs and symptoms of heart failure. That is tachypnea, tachycardia, diaphoresis, and adequate mixing is possible when size of the VSD is moderate. In patient with TGA VSD pulmonary stenosis present with progressive cyanosis, it depends on the severity of obstruction. Large PDA may help in prolonging the survival of these patients. In addition to diagnosis of TGA, echo is helpful in the diagnosis of other associated defects as well as pattern of shunting through the dead defects. Coronary artery anatomy, biventricular function. 2D echo is also helpful in ICU to do balloon atrial septostomy in deeply cyanosed and hemodynamically compromised neonates till further definitive treatment is done. Assessment of LV is important, particularly when present late, so that to see either LV is prepared or not to work as a systemic ventricle. Posterior wall thickness more than 4 mm at the papillary level, globular shape of the LV, intraventricular septum moving with the LV, and LV mass more than 15 gram per meter square is suggestive of prepared LV. Preoperatively, we should evaluate for hemodynamic status of the patient, any inotrope requirements, any arrhythmias. Intravenous and intra-arterial access should be taken. Laboratory values should be evaluated. Screening for the sepsis should be done, and other non-cardiac organ systems should be evaluated. In NICU, most admissions are with severe dehydration, cyanosis, and metabolic acidosis. Initial volume therapy, in addition to oxygen, is required. Correction of metabolic acidosis should be done. Prostaglandin infusion should be started to maintain the patency of the ductus. Increased blood flow and volume overload results in left to right shunting at the atrial level. We should maintain normothermia and normal blood sugar level. Balloon atrial septostomy, either bedside under echo guidance or in cath lab under fluoroscopy, is done as an emergency salvage procedure. Successful balloon atrial septostomy is indicated by immediate improvement in oxygen saturation with increased fluttering of the lower margin of the septum. At least there should be 5 mm defect in the atrial septum. Arterial switch operation is the ideal procedure. It is described by Jetten in 1976. It establishes ventricular-arterial concordance. Usually it is done in patients younger than 4 weeks of age, as afterwards LV may not be able to handle systemic pressure post-operatively if it is left too long in the low pressure, low resistance pulmonary circuit. Rarely, depending on the particular coronary anatomy, coronary translocation may not be feasible, and switch is not recommended. It is also contraindicated in infant with significant left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. You can see post-switch neo-aorta along with the coronary buttons are sutured to the left ventricle posteriorly, and pulmonary artery translocated anteriorly through Lacombe maneuver, and it is anastomosed to the right ventricle. Our anesthetic goal is to maintain heart rate, contractility and preload, maintain patency of the duct with prostaglandin infusion, avoid increasing PVR relative to SVR. In particularly patient with VSD with signs and symptoms of heart failure, interventions to reduce PVR are not indicated. Monitoring, femoral artery monitoring, preductal radial artery monitoring, if there is a coarctation suspected. CVP infusion for volume infusion as well as to infuse inotropes. SpO2 pre and post ductal, CtCO2, ABG monitoring, ECG, nasopharyngeal and rectal temperature should be measured, urine output, ACT, and NIRS for regional cerebral oxygen saturation. We usually induce patient with narcotic and or inhalation anesthesia. Ventilate with 6 to 8 ml of tidal volume. Low PEEP and low peak inspiratory pressure is advisable as it does not reduce the pulmonary blood flow, and low FiO2 for maintenance of ductal patency. Priming with plasmalyte A, blood and albumin. Antifibrinolytic agent should be given to reduce post-operative bleeding. Procedure is done under moderate to deep hypothermia, and PCA should be avoided if possible. Hematocrit is maintained more than 25%. We usually give Del-Nido cardioplasia in TGA with interventricular septum, but when patient present with TGA with VSD, we usually give St. Thomas first while doing VSD repair, and followed by Del-Nido cardioplasia while doing arterial switch surgery. Cross clamp is removed after aortic and coronary reconstruction, and pulmonary reconstruction is usually done while doing rewarming to reduce the cross clamp and total CPB time. Conventional ultrafiltration and modified ultrafiltration should be done to reduce tissue edema, to reduce inflammatory markers, and to increase hematocrit. Mean arterial pressure around 35 millimeter mercury is accepted in infant with interventricular septum. Slightly higher pressures are required in patient with TGA with VSD. Patient is wean off at 36 degrees centigrade. We usually put PD on all the neonates for switch, but dialysis we started whenever there is a decrease in the urine output or there is a positive balance of the fluid occur. To keep chest open is decision based on the intraoperative course of the patient. L-line and PA-line decisions as per the requirement of that case. We usually ventilate to achieve normal respiratory parameters with minimum FiO2 postoperatively. Usually ST segment is monitored to see for any coronary issues. NTG infusion should be started as a coronary dilator as well as to reduce preload and afterload. Inhaled nitric oxide in cases of elevated PA pressures are helpful. Suboptimal LV working against a systemic SVR after surgery put this LV at upper part of pressure volume curve. So reduction in afterload to LV is mandatory. So we usually infuse Milinon or levosimendan as an afterload reducing agent. Epinephrine or norepinephrine can be added as required. Volume infusion should be cautiously given as sudden bolus of fluid may cause distension of the left ventricle, or it also distends the pulmonary artery. That may cause stinking of the neocoronary buttons, and that may cause myocardial ischemia. Our hemodynamic goal post-operatively is to maintain mean arterial pressure above 35 mm/G, maintain coronary perfusion with adequate afterload reduction. Excessive hypotension are managed by reducing the dose of Milinon or adding small dose of norepinephrine. Usually we do 25 to 50 ml per kg per day negative fluid balance for initial 2 days. PD is used in patients where this is not achieved or when renal failure sets in. ECHO is useful in identifying the cause of LV dysfunction postoperatively. Impaired LV function is treated with further afterload reduction, and vasopressors are used to maintain coronary perfusion in case of low blood pressure with good LV function. LVOTO is treated with decrease in the dose of afterload reducing agent and with volume infusion. High lactate for more than 12 hours are associated with increased morbidity and mortality. Attention is directed towards lowering length of stay in ICU and hospital. Early extubation strategies are advised in many centers. Sedation and ventilation for initial few hours is reasonable. Integrated ECMO, we sometimes when patient present with borderline LV, ASO is recommended up to 2 months with ECMO or LVAD support. It is also useful when patient is difficult to wean from the CPB. After putting ECMO, daily echo monitoring should be done. Try to wean ECMO when LV mass is adequate or shape of LV changes to globular or ratio of LV and RV pressure is more than 85%. So two-stage procedure is done up to the age of 6 months, where first stage is PA bending with or without modification, and the second stage is ASO. It can be allowed up to age of 6 months. So single stage or sequential PA bending is done so that LV pressure is about 70% of the RV pressure without LV dysfunction. Usually this leads to LV myocardial hypertrophy within a day or two, and ASO can be done after 7 days to 1 month of if preparedness of LV is attained by this PA bending. Atrial switch is a physiological correction. It is indicated when coronary translocation is not feasible. Intra-atrial baffle is made just like in this figure, so that systemic venous blood is directed to LV through mitral valve, and pulmonary venous blood is directed to right ventricle through tricuspid valve. Immediate mortality is much less as compared to ASO, but it causes long-term RV dysfunction as well as life-threatening arrhythmias. It is probably ASO surgery most satisfying curative procedure in infant with CSD. Post-operative care highlights the standard and care of the ICU. Inotopes will be used very scientific manner with echo support. General post-operative measures all add to the final outcome of the patient. In experienced centers with good surgical repair, most patients can be extubated within 12 to 24 hours. Thank you.
Right.
Thanks for all the presentations. May I request Dr. Suresh Changure sir to give your valued expert opinion about all three presentations.
Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you very much to all the speakers, Fraser, Ambesh, and Vijay. I think for the concise and the very precise presentation as well. You see, the topics when it comes to the pediatric cardiac anesthesia, the topics are quite relevant. And I found that, like, especially the first topic with readers, which relates to that role of TE in the intraoperative decision making. Like, if you go through the history and what's happening even now, the stress is laid more on the adult TE. And most of the pediatric people who are pediatric and cardiac anesthesiologists, they have learned TE either by themselves or from the guidance of the cardiologist, pediatric cardiologist, because the sessions that usually happen with the TE training, especially with congenital cases, is quite less. So when you look into the incidence, almost close to 11% is the incidence of a new finding to directly influence the decision making, on-table decision making of a congenital cardiac surgery. And that's before the surgery, or rather before the corrective surgery. And after the corrective surgery, the incidence of a residual lesion is almost close to 8%. So that means there is always a big role for the TE to play for intraoperative decision making, as well as in the post-operative, immediate post-op analysis of the section of the correction. Now, coming to the Taylor's topic, it's again very important about the low cardiac output, because it's one of the things which now with the trend that is coming up with what you call as the fast tracking, especially in congenital cardiac surgery. This particular aspect has got a bigger bearing in that, because you see, as we discussed, this usually happens after about 8 to 12 hours after the surgery. By the time the patient would have been out of the ventilator and they would have started tapering the inotrope as well. Now, low cardiac output, detection of low cardiac output is quite tricky, as it was clearly mentioned in his talk. And then what's more important is the low tissue perfusion rather than the low cardiac output. Of course, low cardiac output definitely results in low tissue perfusion, but there was one point that you mentioned, like treating vasoplegia. So vasoplegia state for a patient with loss of collateral, he might not be having a low cardiac output, but at the same time, there will be a low tissue perfusion, and he will have all the signs, most of the signs of the low cardiac output, but it will not be a low cardiac output as such. So identifying these small intricacies and then planning the management is very, very important. And then Ritesh has very well covered almost what are the complexities of the transposition of great arteries. We have seen the history, and we have gone through the developments in TGA, especially in India, right from difficulty in the diagnosis of, and then coming on to the diagnosis usually by the echo, and then coming onto the table where we cannot operate or the ventricle is already regressed, and then the stage of Mustard and Pennings. And now the ASO is being done almost on the first day or even the second day. So there's a transition that has happened over a period of time in the management of ASO. And all credit should go towards the surgical team, the cardiologist, and the cardiac anesthesia and the intensive care part of it. Thank you very much. I think we should go on to the discussion part of it now.
Thank you, sir, for the very summation.
Thank you, sir.
I think there is a very shortage of the time. We are off shooting 5 o'clock. But before finishing, I will definitely take one question from the audience that Dr. Deepak Tempe sir has specifically asked this question to Dr. Kamlesh. Is goal-directed therapy practiced in children? If yes, what is its status?
Thank you, sir, for asking this question. So yes, I think there is a role of goal-directed therapy in pediatric cardiac anesthesia and ICU, but we cannot apply to the universally to all the children. But yes, we can tell to the juniors that these are the goals, like maintain this preload or CEP or RA, or watch for these aspects, and then try to maintain the afterload reduction, or when to start diuretics and all. I can say that, sir, rather than goal-directed therapy, there are algorithm pathways can be laid down for the ICUs, which will be highly, can be easily been followed. Like if there is a XYZ preload is low, then measure this, measure the heart, see the heart rate, see the CEP, see the other things, and then go for the fluid resuscitation kind of a thing. So algorithm pathways will be much more easily adaptable and safe compared to goal-directed therapy for pediatric cardiac anesthesia and surgery. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Before ending, one last question of Dr. Sanjeevani to Dr. Sridhar Joshi. How do you identify LSVC in pre-op and intra-op period? Because she has asked many questions.
Okay.
Dr. Sridhar?
Yes, sir. Thanks. Left subclavian vein is close to 8 to 10% in congenital heart disease. Most often in a 4-chamber view itself, in a midesophageal 4 chambers view, you will see a vertically oval structure over the lateral mitral annulus. That's pretty obvious as a left subclavian vein for that matter. Advance the probe a little bit more, you can easily see it open into the coronary sinus. That's much more definitive. To be more precise, if there's still doubt on the anatomy, I guess the left upper limb agitated bubble saline will help the bubbles to be visible into that vertical structure, and that's most definitive of the left subclavian vein.
Are we dealing with subclavian vein or the
left superior vena cava? I'm sorry, I misspelled it. Left superior vena cava.
I just want to make one passing comment in lecture. Instead of using the fenestrated VST for tetralogy, it's more or less a common practice to leave the PFO open in tetralogy of Fallot if you suspect that patient is going to land up with the right ventricular failure post-operatively. Thank you. That's a comment. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So I think thank you all. Thank you all the speakers. Thank you all senior esteemed chairpersons. And back to the organizers.